Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Anastasia and I make art-related videos. In this video I'll be comparing two sets of affordable gouache paint, Reeves and Arteza. I've used both sets extensively at this point, and in this video I'll show you swatches of each set for color and opacity. At the end I'll show you how I painted this handsome gentleman using the Arteza gouache. I have a ton of information for you in this video, so I will be speaking quickly. For full disclosure, I am both an Arteza affiliate and an Amazon affiliate, so links to both sets are affiliate links. This doesn't affect my honest review of either product or sway my opinion towards one set or the other. You can find links to all these products in the description box below. At the time that I'm recording this voiceover, I've used the Arteza paint dozens of times, but this footage is from when I first received this set from Arteza. I've had the Reeves for almost a year. The outer packaging is fairly similar. Both sets have 24 colors, and the Reeves was packaged in a similar way in the box, although the Arteza packaging was a lot sturdier. Arteza gouache has 12 milliliters per tube, and Reeves only has 10 milliliters per tube, so you get more paint with the Arteza set. The Arteza has metal tubes like more professional paint has, while the Reeves has plastic tubes. For me personally though, the biggest difference in the packaging besides these facts are the caps. The Arteza caps have a great grip to them. This made a huge difference while I did the swatches, as my hands started to hurt while opening all the little Reeves tubes. If you have carpal tunnel or arthritis, this would definitely make a big difference for you. I've been using my Reeves in this plastic palette, as gouache can become re-wet just like watercolor can. As you see, the texture of the Reeves in the palette is a little bit strange and uneven. The shininess in some areas I believe is due to the addition of glycerin and other fillers, but I'll get more to that a little later. First, I'm swatching each color straight from the tube with only a tiny bit of water on the brush. Next, I will swatch the re-wet colors from my palette, and I'll repeat all this for the Arteza gouache as well. I expect the paint from the tubes to be thicker and more opaque, but I thought it would be useful to compare the two methods of using gouache. Here you can see the Reeves gouache is overall pretty opaque, though some colors are a little more opaque than others, and that's expected. It goes on smoothly, though sometimes I have a little trouble squeezing it from the tube. I'll get some clear liquid coming out as the pigment tends to separate from the fillers. This doesn't happen with any other gouache I've used, so it is one of the clues that Reeves uses more filler. Gouache is supposed to be composed of two ingredients: pigment, the same pigment used in watercolor paint but ground more coarsely, and binder, usually gum arabic, also the same binder as watercolor. There are three ways that gouache can become opaque as opposed to watercolor, which is usually a lot more transparent. One of the ways is just by the pigment itself being very rich. Certain pigments, though not all, are naturally opaque when they are ground this way for gouache. They're ground a lot more finely for watercolor, and that is why they're more transparent. The second way is by adding white, either through the manufacturing process or through mixing at home. White makes all pigments more opaque, always. The third way is by adding fillers and opacifying agents, which leaves less room for intense pigment in the actual tube and can make for some duller colors and also weird mixing effects. I'll do more direct comparison of these swatches in a bit, but first I just have to set up my Arteza palette using the exact same style palette as my Reeves one. Something I really appreciate about the Arteza gouache is that the pigments they use in each color are listed on the tube. Most of them are even single pigment colors, or a single pigment plus white as a convenience mix. This helps make for cleaner colors and easier color mixing. The paint came out of the tubes smoothly with no weird separation and appeared nice and rich in the pans. The texture reminds me a lot of the Winsor & Newton gouache. I was eager to see how they compared with my Reeves ones once dried in a palette, but first I did my full strength swatches straight from the tubes. The colors were very nice and a bit more opaque than the Reeves. I barely used any water on the brush, and this led to the thicker swatches of paint cracking a bit. This happens with my Winsor & Newton gouache paint as well. It's a common trait of gouache. You can't really use gouache in thick layers because it will crack. The fact that the Reeves one didn't crack is actually another clue that they use glycerin, which is a humectant agent. Still, this is something to be aware of. You won't see it here in this video, but my Arteza paint did crack in the palette as well after being re-wet and reused a few times. In this way, it behaved exactly like my Winsor & Newton gouache, which also cracks a lot. If you want to avoid this, you can add a tiny bit of glycerin yourself when you are creating your palette, though it will make your paint a tiny bit weaker and a tiny bit less matte. I have since done this with my palette, and it is worth it to me to not have the paint crack. You only need 2 drops of glycerin or honey per pan, and the bonus is it actually helps the colors re-wet more beautifully. Here though, I let my newly squeezed Arteza paints dry overnight, and then I sprayed the whole palette with water to re-wet. This is where I saw the biggest difference so far between the two sets. The palette swatches from the Arteza were less opaque than the tube swatches from Arteza, of course, but they weren't streaky like the Reeves swatches. They behaved a lot more like an opaque version of watercolor. Alright, here are the 2 sets of swatches side by side, and I'm going to compare similar rows between the 2 sets. So on top here we have the Arteza, on the bottom we have the Reeves, and these are kind of the similar red and earth tone colors. So on top, the Arteza you can see are overall, I would say, more opaque, and the palette swatches from the Arteza are less streaky. Here's a comparison of the Arteza and the Reeves blues. So the Arteza is on the bottom. You can always tell which ones are Arteza because of the squares there that I've copied from the packaging. I love the sky blue from the Arteza. It's much better than the lighter blues in the Reeves. And the cobalt is pretty much the same as ultramarine, just less opaque in the Reeves. And so that was kind of redundant. The ultramarine in the Arteza was a lot brighter. I'm not sure if you can really see just how much brighter in the video. The Prussian blues were pretty similar. I actually really like the Prussian blue from the Reeves set. It is not a bad paint at all, and I still plan on using that specific color a lot in my sketchbooks and stuff like that. Here are the black and the gray from the Reeves, and then to compare the black and the gray from Arteza, and you can see there's a pretty significant difference in the evenness of the color and the opacity on those. Here are some of the greens from the Reeves, and you can see some of them are a little dull or streaky, and while I do like the dark green and the emerald, they're not very rich. Compared with the Viridian is similar to the emerald. These are the Arteza, but it's much more opaque and even. And then we have some semi-opaque greens here, lighter greens. That Viridian is really a beautiful color though. Here I see a huge difference between the 2 sets. So these are the yellows and peachy colors from the Reeves, and they are all pretty weak, especially when re-wet from the palette. That yellow ochre tended to muddy up my color mixes every time I tried to use it. The yellow ochre with the Arteza here is much, much nicer and much more opaque as well, you can see. And the yellows are just very even, and they are marked as semi-transparent, semi-opaque. So real quick before I get to that Arteza painting portrait demo, a quick word on opacity and color mixing with gouache. Gouache is sometimes called opaque watercolor for the reasons I discussed earlier, but there seems to be some common misconceptions about that here on YouTube, so I thought I'd try to clear it up a little bit. More opaque gouache does mean that it's better quality, but only when the opacity is due to more pigment being used. The trade-off of having more pigment is that the paint will tend to crack when it's applied thickly. This is worth it for cleaner colors and mixes and more opacity though. By the way, I will write more about the specific pigments used in the Arteza gouache in the description of this video for anyone who wants more information. I did research every single pigment they use, and they're all of good quality and used as standard pigments across many brands and paint types. Okay, so opacity doesn't always mean better quality with gouache though, if that opacity is coming from adding white or adding fillers. There is a right time to add white for specific goals, so adding white isn't inherently bad. It all depends on what you need. For example, the Arteza sky blue color is a single blue pigment mixed with the binder and then mixed with white. And that's what you have in the tube there. That's very convenient when painting skies because I don't have to mix my own light blue by mixing a blue and a white paint together. But imagine if that were the only blue provided and that white wasn't added specifically to be a sky blue color, but was added because they didn't use as much pigment and they were adding the white to make the paint appear more opaque. Then, if I wanted a richer dark blue, I might try to add black. But that white that's already in the tube and the black will mix together and they will make gray plus a little bit of blue. So I would actually get a pretty muddy color. It would actually be impossible to reach certain color mixes if I already have white in all my colors. So while I'm glad that the white is there in that sky blue Arteza color because it's meant for a specific purpose, I don't want white in all my tubes, even if it makes all my colors more opaque. The pigment that makes most ultramarine blues, and that's of all brands and all different paint types, it's usually the same exact pigment. And that tends to be just naturally more transparent than other pigments. Remember, these are pigments that are coming out of the ground. They're all different chemically. The pigment used for ultramarine blue happens to be fairly close to a primary blue, and that's why it's used so much, and it happens to be pretty transparent. This means it would actually mix very cleanly with other colors. If I added black to an ultramarine blue, I wouldn't get a gray, like how I was talking about if I added black to that sky light blue color. I do hope this makes sense, and I'm happy to answer any other questions on this topic. Color mixing can actually get pretty complicated, and I see beginners assume that opacity means quality pretty often, so I wanted to illustrate that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Overall, I'm telling you this because I noticed that the Arteza is only a little bit more opaque than the Reeves, but the reasons it's opaque appear to be due to the pigments. The reasons that the Reeves is opaque is due to the addition of white and fillers. And this is why I struggled a lot with muddy colors from the Reeves. So, the final verdict, it may be pretty obvious that I prefer the Arteza, especially for color mixing. Does this mean that the Reeves is bad? Definitely not. The price that I paid for Reeves was so low that it would be worth it even as a children's paint. And I will continue to use it in my sketchbook, especially certain colors like that lovely Prussian blue. I won't really attempt to do full paintings with the Reeves though, or really mix colors, because they do get so muddy and I don't really have as much control over the color that I get. Certain colors, certain tubes of the Reeves, I'll never touch again. I was pleasantly surprised that the Arteza was not only better than the Reeves, but rivaled my Winsor & Newton paints. I find myself reaching for my Arteza palette more often than my Winsor & Newton palette because the colors included are thoughtfully arranged and a lot more convenient, like that sky blue color. The Winsor & Newton is much more expensive, and the colors are brighter and they are more opaque. The Winsor & Newton is undoubtedly of better quality, but the difference isn't as significant as I would have expected given the low price of the Arteza. If you've struggled with cheap gouache in the past, I do have to recommend the Arteza. If you already have Reeves, don't feel bad, you can definitely still use it, but I'd suggest supplementing it with the Arteza set or just getting the primary colors from a high-end brand so that you can get those clean color mixes. Even if you already have expensive gouache, I'd actually still recommend the Arteza because it's so convenient, especially if you go through paint quickly. When I'm just doing quick sketches, I would rather use up my Arteza because I know I can buy another set of it for sometimes under $20 than use my very expensive Winsor & Newton paint. So I hope that helps clear up the differences in these two sets, and maybe I helped you learn something about gouache in general. Next, we're going to do the demo of the painting. Alright, time to paint this fella. So first I actually used the Arteza watercolor paper, and I used an Arteza watercolor colored pencil to trace my sketch onto this paper with a lightbox, because the watercolor pencil will just kind of dissolve when I add paint over it, so I won't see pencil lines through. Then I started with like a shadowy color that I mixed with the mauve pale color and some neutral tones to kind of just get the values down, so get my darkest darks in there and leave the lighter areas kind of blank. Then I wanted to go into the background, and I wanted it to be kind of a gray, hazy, purpley sort of color. And then I started going in with my actual colors, and I was really pleasantly surprised by how nice the skin tones I could get, how nice they were to mix. With the Reeves, I have struggled a lot with skin tones because I would mix a color that looks right and then it would dry and look completely gray or completely muddy or just weird, and you definitely get what you think you're gonna get a lot more with the Arteza because they do mix very cleanly and very nicely. It was pretty easy to get some skin tones here. Then I kind of went too far on the hair, so I scaled that back by adding more to the background there. And I got some wispy areas in the hair, and I kind of wanted this painting to be a little bit loose and not super detailed. I wanted it to definitely look like a painting. And I kind of liked it at this stage here. I kind of overworked it a little bit and then got it back almost to something similar to this stage at the end, but I learned so much during this process. So I just wanted to kind of block in the basic colors of everything at this point. And I wanted my transition areas between like the highlight on the skin and the shadow on the skin. I didn't want to blend these by just pushing my paintbrush across the two colors and blending them that way. I wanted to blend by actually mixing an intermediary color between those two. So I'm actually laying in cells of color and sort of cell shading with specific mixes rather than blending, like mechanically blending by actually pushing my brush across the paint. So here I felt like he was a little bit too pink, and so I added some more yellow tones and even a little bit of green. I think I went a little bit too far there, so I wanted to scale that back a little bit. I started to add some detail to the eyes and some red tones, and I'm feeling like I'm losing my darkest darks, so I went back in with a dark, I think purple and burnt umber kind of a mix, and I went back and re-established my shadow shapes. Then I felt like my blending was being lost, so I needed to mix more intermediary colors between the shadows and the light. And I do recommend with painting, your painting always will look better and more painterly if that's the style that you're going for, if you're having those transitions through your color mixing. So the work for doing those color transitions should be happening on your palette, not on your painting, if that makes sense, because you're mixing each color and then placing it where it goes. So here I start to kind of regain the general light to dark ratios that I was going for, and I just kind of keep going back and forth between reestablishing my highlights, reestablishing my shadows, mixing even more intermediary tones, getting more details in there, and the rest of it is just kind of a back and forth of that process, just building up the painting and making adjustments as I saw that I needed to. And here we are, time to finally peel off the tape. So again, if you have any questions about either of these sets, about color mixing, about paint ingredients, I would be happy to answer any of those. All the links are in the description, as well as a little bit more information. And please let me know what you thought of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really appreciate your support, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, guys.